so that we can make sure we stay to an hour. I'm going to kick us off here briefly before we get to the presentation. So quick ground rules. We will be taking questions at the very end via chat. You all should have chat function. It's up in the top toolbar for you all. We also will have folks moderating the chat and answering some questions as the presentation goes along. We also will be providing an email address at the end of the presentation in case there's any questions that come to you afterward, anything that you want to follow up with us on, or if there's anything additional that you want to submit if for whatever reason the chat is not working for you. I will continue to let guests in. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Tom Welly. He is our Community Risk Reduction Manager, and he is kind of the overseer of the folks that will be giving us the presentation today. So with that, Tom, I will hand it off to you for some opening remarks.
Thanks, Allison. Thank you all for joining us tonight to learn about the home ignition zone. Home ignition zone is critical to improving structural survivability in wildfire. The information presented tonight helps us to increase ignition resistance of our homes, businesses, and structures. If they don't ignite, they don't burn. These concepts are voluntary best practices based in science and tested through research. But it takes you as homeowners, neighbors, and communities to take action collectively to make this work. We must take responsibility for reducing risk around our own properties. By doing so, we not only lose less structures, but we also improve the effectiveness and safety for our firefighters, and we recover from the event faster. So, Kyle Reed, Fire Risk Reduction Specialist for the Oregon Office of the State Fire Marshal, is going to lead us on this journey of the home ignition zone. Allison, back to you.
Well, hi, everyone. My name is Kyle Reed, and I'm one of the Fire Risk Reduction Specialists with the Office of State Fire Marshal. So today's topic is the home ignition zone. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully this is one of the many webinars you join us on in the coming months. So we have a lot of information to get through, so we're going to jump right into this. So first of all, we need to talk about what causes structures to ignite during wildfires. You know, we have this image from, many people have firsthand experiences of the large flame front that they've seen often at a distance or maybe in their community. They have images they've seen on social media or in traditional media of large flames heading down towards communities, and that preconceived notion that these large flames are taking out homes based on a lot of research and studies isn't actually the fact. A lot of times, especially when there's been some mitigation work done ahead of time, a lot of times that flame front can pass through areas with homes or communities without igniting those structures. So then we have to ask, well, what's actually igniting those structures? And more often than not, it's actually those embers that get cast off from the main body of the fire. They may be accumulating in gutters, on the roofs, around structures, igniting, anything from vegetation to other materials we store around our homes. So again, that's really a big component that's not talked about a whole lot is what we can do to mitigate those little things to help protect our homes and communities. So I've got a video here that I'm going to show, demonstrates exactly what we're talking about with embers. So this is a video from the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. And, you know, this is a great video. So what they've done here is we'll see they've created a home inside a laboratory area. They've used different kind of building materials, different kind of roofing materials, different kinds of siding. They've incorporated vegetation around the home. They've put pine needles and bark mulch around the home, just like we would more than often find in a real world situation. And as you just saw there, they have ember generators where they're actually going to be loading material to be burnt and cast onto this home. So again, as you can see, a lot of the stuff they're putting out is stuff we would normally see around homes. So this image here looks a little unrealistic, you know, when you first look at it. How could that many embers be, you know, blowing towards a home? But in a real world situation, that's what we're going to see a lot of times in those intense fires, is this ember shower where they just kind of blow with the wind and accumulate in the nooks and the crannies around the home, in the mulch, in the gutters, and all those different places. So again, with this this video here, we're going to see how all these different materials that were used to build the house and the vegetation around it reacts. So right off the bat here, we can see this vinyl gutter failing very quickly once it ignited, melted and burned. We can see the vegetation around the home already burning. The material on the roof, the pine needles and stuff like that was put up there, it's on fire already. This corner here that's starting to burn, keep an eye on that, because here in a couple more slides, that area is going to really be taking off as the wood siding gets involved with that portion of the fire. And again, we can see the vinyl gutters failing. We can see the embers hitting the roof here, the dry vegetation around it. And again, this was that same side we were looking at with the vegetation and the wood siding there. And it's very involved at this point. So this next image here is going to show a side-by-side of some fiber cement siding versus some vinyl siding. And on the right-hand side, we can see that vinyl siding just kind of melting away and falling off, whereas the fiber cement siding is a lot more resistant to those embers in the fire. One area we don't often think about is those vents and other entries into our home, and how embers can get into those places. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in detail here in a little bit, but that's definitely something to keep in mind as well. Again, we've got an open window here. The screen doesn't hold up very long before it melts through and burns, which not only lets direct flame contact in, but also embers. So this is a great example, again, of how those embers are going to affect, you know, homes or other structures in the community. So before we get too far along, I wanted to throw this slide in there and talk a little bit about the fire behavior triangle. So many people have heard about the fire triangle when it comes to, you know, how fires ignite. You know, you need to have a heat source, fuel, and oxygen. Well, with wildfires, once the fire ignites, this fire behavior triangle really dictates how that fire is going to spread and react. So the three things that are going to influence that fire is the fuels, the weather, and the topography. So with the weather, we're looking at temperature, we're looking at relative humidity, we're looking at wind speed and direction, we're looking at precipitation, all those things on both the short term and the long term. Are we in drought conditions? Has it rained recently? How long has it been since it rained? How much rain did we get? All those factors are going to play into the fuels and how that fire is going to react. The same with topography. So with topography, we have slope and aspect. So when we're looking at the slope, we're looking at, is your home located in the valley bottom in a flat area? Is it located, mid slope on a hillside, or is it located up at the top of the hill, at the ridge top, or somewhere in between? We're also looking at how steep is that area around your home. Is it a fairly flat, even if you're mid slope, or is it really steep? The other factor there is the aspect. So the aspect is, what side of the hill your home is located on, the north slope, the south slope, east or west. That southwest slope generally receives a lot more surface heating over the course of the day than, say, the north slope does. We'll see fire activity typically pick up on those southwest slopes a lot more than, say, on the north side. So that's another big factor as well. We'll also see typically different kinds of vegetation in those areas, which also play into different things we need to look at around our home. And the last one there is fuel. So that's going to be the amount of fuel, the arrangement of the fuel, both horizontally and vertically, the fuel moisture content, and the kinds and types of materials. So again, a lot of times when we're thinking about fuel, when we talk about wildfires, it's that vegetation component. But again, potentially anything around our homes is fuel for a wildfire if it's flammable. So this is going to be firewood piles, lumber piles. It could be the cardboard. It could be whatever that we store around our home. So we need to think of fuel in that terms when we're looking at stuff around our homes. The big reason I brought this slide up is when we're looking at ways and things we can do to protect our homes and communities, we have no control over the weather. We can't, make the rain come. We can't make the wind stop. We can't do any of that. Other than when we're looking to purchase or rent a home, we have no control over the topography of where that place is located. So the one thing we have control over is the fuel, both with vegetation and all the other fuel sources around our homes. Moving into some of the home ignition zone concepts. So this was developed specifically by the National Fire Protection Association and the FireWise program. There's a number of other programs out there that are very similar. You're going to see slightly different names or slightly different distances, but ultimately a lot of the concepts are going to be very similar or the same. And again, this is the best practices that's been developed from both laboratory experiments and in-field studies and proofing. So with the home ignition zone through the FireWise program, we break this up into 3 zones. We have our immediate zone, which is from 0 to 5 feet out. We have our intermediate zone, which is from 5 feet to 30 feet out, and our extended zone from 30 feet to 100 feet. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but potentially that extended zone may go beyond that 100-foot mark. The other thing with the immediate zone to remember is it's not just the area around your home, it's the home itself. And in those situations where you have something like a wooden deck attached to the back of it, you're going to start that immediate zone off the back of that wooden deck. So jumping into the first area, so we're looking at the structure itself. So with the structure, we want to make sure that, if we're either building or remodeling, that we're using fire-resistant materials. There's a lot of building materials out there that are fire-resistant, and there's other options that are much more prone to fire. So we want to make sure that we're using those fire-resistant materials. And we'll just go around the circle here. So looking at roofing first. So roofing comes in fire rating that's Class A, Class B, or Class C. Class A is going to be your most resistant to fire. So it's going to be your best option. So some common types of materials that have Class A roofing are asphalt shingles and metal roofing. There's some other options out there as well that aren't nearly as common. One thing about your Class A roofing, make sure you do some research ahead of time. Some of those will require some extra steps to meet that Class A ranking. you may need to have a special underlayment or something like that added underneath the roofing material to get that Class A rating. Moving on to fire-resistant siding and decking. So again, there's a lot of options out there. Fiber cement is a great siding option that's fire-resistant. You can use metal siding or some brick and masonry options as well. We see a lot of wood siding T111 here in the Pacific Northwest with the abundance of wood products we have in the area. And, if that's something we have, we need to make sure that we're maintaining that. So in those situations where a piece of the siding may be rotten or the paint's peeled off and exposed to, bare wood or stuff like that, those embers are more likely to ignite in those areas. So we want to make sure that we're maintaining that siding. We'll go into some other details here in a little bit about making sure we have a fire-free zone in that area, especially if we have something like wooden siding. Decking material, again, is another thing to look at. So we could have a concrete patio or metal decking, which is both very safe. There's other options out there as well with different kinds of composite materials or wood decking. There's a lot of information both on the IBHS website and on NFPA Firewise website about all these topics. But some of that stuff I found pretty fascinating about the decking. Could be as simple as, spacing out your joists a little bit more or increasing the distance between the boards on your decking could go a long way in preventing ignitions there. Another thing to look at is screening underneath decks. So especially those low decks, if we have 1/8 inch wire mesh screening underneath of it, that's going to help mitigate debris from accumulating in those areas, but it's also going to help keep embers from going in there as well. Another one there with windows. So, double, triple pane windows, tempered glass are much more fire resistant than what we had in years ago with single pane windows and the such like that. One thing we see a lot of, though, is people plant vegetation in front of those as a privacy barrier. And what happens if those ignite, you have a lot of heat that builds up in front of those, and there is the potential for those windows to crack or break because of that. So again, vegetation in front of windows may not be your best option. Another thing I like to remind people, now many people have skylights in their homes. Some of those are plastic and some of those are glass. The big thing there is making sure we don't have a lot of debris accumulating around those, whether it's sticks, branches, pine needles, leaves, whatever the case is. So that way those can't ignite and cause a problem there. Again, with the vents like we saw in the video, it's a good idea to have 1/8 inch metal screening over those. Again, that helps mitigate helps mitigate embers from coming into those areas. Another option out there is there are some commercially built screens or commercially built vents that have a combination of screens and baffles built into them to help mitigate ember intrusion into your home. So that's another option out there as well. The last one here I have is fencing. And, for a long time, it was really hard for me to think about how fencing could really threaten my home. If, I've got a fence that's 20, 30, 40 feet away, however far from my home, if that ignites out back, how's that going to affect my home? And essentially, that fencing is like a wick, and it'll burn from board to board all the way potentially to your home if it's not extinguished. And we've seen that on fires, here throughout Oregon and other western states. So a simple solution to that is that first 5 feet or so around your home, change out that wooden fencing for another option. It could be a fire-resistant fencing material. You could have metal or brick or masonry or something like that. So there's a lot of options there as well. A couple other things that we want to look at here is, branches that are over homes or outbuildings. So we want to prune those up. So that way the branches aren't sitting right there on the roof. We also want to make sure that we're removing those leaves and needles from the roofs and the gutters. Again, that's great tinder for embers to land in and ignite, right there on your roof or on the side of your house. So moving on here to that immediate zone. So we've talked about the structure itself and some fire resistant materials. Now we're going to look at, what we can do or what we should do around our home. So that first 5 feet around our home, we would like to see a 5-foot barrier created. And this could be done with rock. It could be done with concrete, bare dirt, could be pavers. Any kind of non-flammable material there to create a fire break. And the idea there is if a surface fire is approaching your home, we've got a 5-foot fire trail all the way around your home to keep that surface fire from advancing and potentially igniting your home. In this area, though, again, we want to make sure that we don't have a lot of vegetation. Now, I'm not going to say we can't have, the begonias or whatever, something like that, planted in a planter on the deck or a hanging basket. But what we don't want to see is that continuous fuel bed of blackberries or brush or whatever right up to the home. We want to minimize that vegetation again in this area, and if there is going to be anything, make sure it's fire resistant. And we'll talk more about fire resistant plants here in a little bit. And then the last thing we see a lot of is all of our other treasures that we store around our homes. Some examples I have here is firewood piles, lumber piles, could be gas cans, it could be the cardboard that we throw in the carport or whatever. Again, this is all potential fuel. So if we have like an enclosed firewood shed with a door on it that seals good, we could have that somewhere close to the home. But in these situations like this, where we're just storing this stuff under the deck, this is potential fuel either for that surface fire advancing or for those embers coming up and igniting homes. So again, we want to, if this is a situation, we want to move all that material, all that firewood, all those lumber piles, that kind of stuff, at least 30 feet away from homes. Moving into our intermediate zone. So now we're at 5 feet out to 30 feet. In this area, we want to maintain the grass. And if we can keep it green, that's great. I understand that the reality of where we are with drought situations in the state, that may not be an option for many people, especially for those outside of city water systems where you're on a well or you have to truck water in or a spring or something like that. In those situations, it's okay to let that grass go dormant and dry out, but we want to make sure that it's mowed short. If we have unmowed grass that's 4 or 5 foot tall and it catches on fire, we're going to easily see 5 to 10 foot flames coming off of that, and we don't want that close to our home. If we have that really short grass, our flames are going to be very short in that situation. One thing I will throw out there is, during fire season, we have had numerous fires over the year start from the mowing of dead or dry grass. So if you are in those summer months during fire season, make sure you check those restrictions ahead of time before you start mowing the dead or dry grass. The other thing we want to do is we want to start looking at the vegetation in our area. And many people have this idea that they have to remove everything and have a moonscape around their home to protect it. And that's far from what we're really looking for. We want to have some vegetation there. We want to make sure it's the right vegetation. And also that, we want to incorporate those fire resistant plants. So the first thing I really encourage people to do before they fire up a saw and start cutting stuff is take a walk around and start looking at, what may need to come out. Maybe you take a roll of flagging with you, start flagging stuff. Look at those larger trees that you want to keep. Especially with conifers. Conifers die from typically the top down. So take a step back. That bottom half of the tree, if you're looking up from the base of it, may look very healthy, but the top may be dying. So if that's the case, we may not want to leave that tree. We may want to pick another one. So kind of take a look at what trees we want to save there. Also in the process, we want to make sure we limb those leaf trees up 6 to 10 feet. And then we're really focused on those ladder fuels. And that's going to be all that other vegetation under those big trees that we're leaving, or maybe smaller trees in an opening that we're leaving. But we're getting rid of that brush component. We're getting rid of the saplings and the young trees. So when we talk about ladder fuels, essentially think of having a large 50-foot tall tree. And just to the side of it, we have a 20-foot tall tree. and then some brush underneath that and some grass. So if a fire comes through there, it's going to burn through the grass, into the brush, and climb into that 20-foot tall tree, and the flames from that will get into the top of the canopy of the larger tree. And that's what we're trying to minimize. Keep that fire on the ground, space out those larger trees, so if they do get into the canopy of one, they're not going to spread from one to the next. So here's some example of a fuels project I worked on years ago, a before and an after here. So you can see in the before, there's a lot of vegetation there, and in that after, there's a lot less. And what's there has been pruned up, and it looks a lot safer. And if a fire goes through this area, it is going to be night and day difference on how this fire reacts. Now, when we look back at what kind of those best practices are, some of these trees are still probably a little close together. And especially with those homeowners who are a little cautious about taking too much out at a time, I think something I encourage them to do is, maybe leave it like this for a couple months and let it grow on you a little bit. And, depending on the time of year when you're pruning or cutting, you may have nicked a tree, gone into the trunk too far. One of these trees may end up dying anyway down the road, and we can take one or two of those out. But you can always come back after the fact and take a couple more of these trees out as you go forward. But again, the big difference here from the before to the after is going to make a considerable difference if a fire was to come through this area. And then we have our extended zone. So from 30 feet out to 100 feet. Really in this area, we're going to be doing a lot of the same things we did before. We're going to be focusing on the grass. Again, we don't have to keep it green, but we don't want it super tall. We want to keep it short. Again, we're focusing on those ladder fuels, getting rid of that underbrush component. And then again, we're pruning up our leaf trees, making sure they're healthy. We may need to space them out a little bit. But as we get farther away from that home, from that 30 to 60 foot out to that 60 plus foot, now past beyond that, our distance between trees starts decreasing a little bit, so we can have a little bit more vegetation in those areas. One thing to note here is those sites, home sites that have a combination of heavy fuel loading and steep slopes, we may need to increase our extended zone beyond that 100 feet. It may need to go out to 150 or 200 feet, depending on the situation. If you have questions or concerns, there's a lot of resources out there that can come out and help homeowners, everybody from our office at OSFM to local fire departments, OSU Extension, foresters, ODF. There's a lot of resources out there to help homeowners, prepare before a wildfire event. So again, here's another before and after of a project I worked on, and that before you can hardly even tell there was anything back there other than brush. You get that underbrush component out of there, those vinies, it looks a whole lot better. Again, some of that area is probably a little bit tighter than what some of those best practices suggest. But again, this is going to be night and day difference if a fire does come through. And also, we can also come back and take out a couple more trees if we need to here down the road. Much easier than trying to deal with everything here all at once. So we talked a little bit about fire-resistant plants through several of these slides. So I just wanted to throw some more information out there on that. We have plants that are both native and ornamental here throughout the state. Some are very fire resistant and some are very fire prone. So this is actually a really good resource that was put together by OSU Extension that highlights those fire resistant plants. The link to this catalog is there at the bottom where you can scan that QR code there and download a PDF copy of this at no cost. But to go through, some of those characteristics of fire-resistant plants, leaves are moist and supple. The plants have little dead wood. There's not a lot of accumulation of dry or dead material within the plant. The sap's water-like and doesn't have a strong odor. And then, the sap and the resin materials are low. So there's a lot of great options out there that are highlighted in this brochure. This brochure also highlights those plants that are drought-resistant as well, in addition to at least what they claim are deer resistant. I'm not sure how much is really deer resistant when they get hungry, but there's a couple out there. So I also wanted to highlight a couple of the highly flammable plants that we see here. So these are going to be some of those ornamentals that are pretty common throughout the area. Those ornamental junipers, a lot of people plant those in and around their homes. You plant them and pretty much forget about them. They don't have a lot of maintenance. They don't require to be watered. They kind of do their thing. You may have to cut them back every now and again, but they're pretty self-sufficient. The problem is it's like throwing a match on gasoline when they burn. Same with Leland cypress, Italian cypress, highly flammable. Rosemary is one we don't really think a whole lot about, but there's a lot of oils in there that are flammable. Arborvitae is another one, and then pampas grass as well. Here's another list of flammable plants that we see that are either invasive or natural throughout the area, native plants. So one of those, Scotch broom, is an invasive that has spread through a lot of the western valleys, especially in southwest Oregon. We see gorse over on the coast, manzanita in several parts of the state, along with ceanothus, blackberries, western juniper there on the east side, sagebrush, and cheatgrass. So this by no means is an all-inclusive list. There's many others out there, but these are some of those that we see on a frequent basis. One thing I often get asked is about outbuildings and barns. And, first of all, should you create defensible space around those? And if so, how do you do that? And the short answer is yes, you should create defensible space around those if you want to increase those survivability of those structures. And the answer to how is everything we just talked about. The same principles apply to a barn or outbuilding as they would to any other structure. We want to consider using fire-resistant materials. We want to make sure the roofs and the gutters are cleared of debris. We want to create that 5-foot buffer around a home, which, as you can see in this picture, can be very challenging with animals and hay. But we want to reduce the fuels and look for where those embers are going to land and accumulate. One thing about outbuildings and barns is we tend to store a lot more treasures in these areas than we do even around our homes, because a lot of times they're out of sight, out of mind, and it doesn't really matter if we pile stuff up out there. Well, again, if we're looking at what ignites a lot of structures, with that being embers, if that's a flammable material, we need to make sure that it's stored properly or put away or stored away from a structure, so that way we don't have a structure ignition. Another question I get asked frequently is, what happens when our home ignition zones overlap? We see this a lot of times inside cities, where we've got small lots, or even outside of cities where two homes were built close to each other on a property line. So what do we do in this situation? So ultimately, what one neighbor does or doesn't do is going to affect each other, and vice versa. So what I always encourage people to do is start with what you have control over, and that's your home and your property. So start there at the home itself, clean out the gutters, work on your first 5 feet, and then move out to that 30-foot mark and do the work there, and move beyond that, either to the property line or to that 100-foot mark, or potentially beyond if you fall into one of those situations where you need to have additional defensible space. And in those areas where you cross over with your neighbor, maybe they're doing something, maybe they're not. Have that conversation with them. Maybe they're not able to do it themselves. They could be disabled, elderly, whatever. You may need to help them out. Help them with some mowing or getting on the roof to clean the gutters. It's important to remember in these situations that, especially when your home ignition zones overlap, you're only as good as what your neighbor's property is. So it's important that you are taking those steps, not only on your home, but encouraging your neighbors in your community to be proactive and be prepared for a wildfire situation. Another question we get asked quite a bit is, what do we do with all the vegetation that we cut? How do we get rid of it? So there's a number of different options here. We can take stuff to the landfill. It can be composted. It can be chipped, piled and burned. It could be lop and scattered. there's not a one-size-fit-all answer here. It's really going to depend on a number of factors. So when we look at, taking stuff to the landfill, typically there's going to be a cost associated with that. So we want to make sure that, that the cost isn't going to be overburdened for you. There's also the potential that maybe we're out at that 100 or 200 foot mark and we can't get a truck or trailer out there. So you're either going to have to drag stuff a long way or come up with another option. Composting, again, is another option, but many times you're going to have a lot more material than you're going to want to compost. And there may be some material intermixed in there that you don't want in your compost. So those are things to consider there. Chipping is another great option to mitigate that vegetation that we cut out. Chippers aren't typically something that everybody has in their garage, though, so there may be some cost associated with either renting a chipper or hiring a crew to help out with that. And again, you're going to run into some of those issues potentially of, how far, if you can't get the chipper to all corners of the property, how far you're willing to drag some of that stuff to chip it. Another thing to think about is what do you do with the chips when you chip it? Sometimes those will come with trucks to blow those chips into trucks to take them out of there. Just like we see here, many times, though, we don't have that option. So those chips are blown back on site. So in that situation, we want to make sure that those chip piles aren't right up against the house or things like that. Many people will take the chips and incorporate them in their gardens or just, spread them out and let them decompose naturally back into the soil. Another option is piling and burning. Again, I wouldn't recommend this right up against the house, but once you get farther away, it is something, potential option to consider. Now, before everybody goes out and lights their pile, because Kyle said it was a great option, remember that debris burning is one of the leading causes of fires throughout the state. And we see a lot of debris burning issues on those shoulder seasons of fire season in the spring over the next couple months and then again in the fall. So, I really encourage people at this point of the year to really think about if it's a good idea to burn or not, because all it takes is that warm, windy day to have something go wrong. Maybe it's not the best idea to burn right now. Maybe it's a better idea to cover that and wait for next fall or winter for conditions to be better. The other thing about burning is we want to make sure we check with that local fire agency ahead of time to make sure burning is even allowed in your area at that time, because burning restrictions vary so much across the state. And then the last one here is Lop and Scatter. And again, this isn't a great option right against your house. Essentially what we're doing here is in those areas where there's not a lot of material, or maybe we've treated it the area in one way or another. Maybe we leave some of that material behind, lop it up so the branches lay on the ground, maybe cut the trunk up in a couple pieces so it decomposes quicker. Again, that's not a great option right against your house, but as you get out farther away, it's another option to consider. Something else we have here is maintenance is critical. Vegetation is going to grow back over time. That's one thing about Oregon. I don't care where you live, what corner of the state, we can grow vegetation. So one thing to think about and consider is how we're going to maintain this going forward. So there's going to be annual maintenance and that around your structure with cleaning gutters and the debris off the roof. There's going to be annual maintenance in that first 5 feet, out to that 30 feet or 50 feet or 100 feet. But as you get out farther away from your home, there's the potential where, you may not have to do stuff every year. You can break some of that up into projects that may, need touched up every couple of years. But really that first, 30 to 60 feet is going to be crucial to maintain that year after year. Again, a lot of that work is going to be up front. And once we get that cleaned up, it's going to be a lot easier maintaining that going forward. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think this is very important. Again, we think so much about fuels during the wildfires as vegetation. And as we've seen time and time again, especially in those wildland urban interfaces, anything that's potential or that's flammable is potential fuel for a fire. Fire doesn't care if you're a tree or a can of gas. So these are just, some common things that we see around homes and buildings: gas cans, propane tanks, firewood piles, lumber piles, lawn furniture, vehicles, outbuildings. It could be hay. It could be the kids' play structure out back. It could be the chicken coop. It could be the straw broom. It could be the welcome mat. All those different things, could be potential fuels. It could be the cardboard we throw out in the carport to get it out of the house. Think about what we have, where we're storing it. On those, when we get into the summer months and fire season, especially on those critical days, maybe we pull the lawn furniture a little bit farther out from the home. I've been on several fires in California on fire assignments where that's what we were doing. Was we were working in front of homes doing triage, and while we're there, we're chucking lawn furniture away from homes, because that's a great spot with that 90-degree angle there for those embers to sit and accumulate and ignite that. And if it's leaned up against the home, it's a potential ignition source right up against the home. So those little things can go a long way in mitigation and protecting your home. A couple other things to consider here as you're out and about, preparing for this upcoming fire season. Is your address visible from the roadway? We take for granted with technology today that, I can hop in a car and type in an address in a GPS, and it's going to take me wherever I need to go. 99% of the time that's the case. But when we have those situations where emergency situations and the system gets overran with use, or maybe we've lost a site due to fire or other natural disasters, how are we going to find you? So it's important to make sure that, the street name is visible, or the street sign is visible, and also your address sign. Again, take a trip out to your driveway, make sure that it's still there, that somebody hasn't ran it over or it's missing. Make sure that the grass hasn't grown up in front of it or a branch hasn't grown in front of it. It makes response for first responders a lot easier. Another thing to think about is, do you have two ways out of, both your home and your community? So, if you have just one driveway and if it gets blocked off or anything, do you have another way to get out? Same with the main egress road to your community. Do you have two ways out of there? If you don't, start thinking, how would you get out if your main egress got cut off? Have a plan ahead of time, well before you have to execute that plan. Another thing to think about is, do you have a bridge? Fire agencies across the state have had to have this hard conversation with homeowners for many years about, your bridge may be adequate for a pickup to cross, but it may not be adequate for a large fire apparatus or equipment to cross that. So, in those situations, fire trucks may not even be able to make it up to your home. So if you have a bridge you're concerned about, contact your local fire department and have them come out and take a look, and at least they can get you pointed in the right direction. You may need to have an engineer come out and take a look or whatever else, but at least you can get pointed in the right direction if you have some concerns about that. Another thing that we always take for granted is, adequate driveway clearance and turnaround spots. We have small vehicles typically as individuals that we drive around, and we're not thinking about, the branch that's growing across the driveway 10 or 12 feet up. But your tender operator who's bringing a load of water up to your home definitely is. They don't want to crack out that windshield. They don't want to break their mirrors because they've got to operate that vehicle safely. So again, we want to make sure we have adequate clearance for those larger apparatus. Same with a turnaround spot. We don't want to get a 3,000-gallon tender up to a home site with no turnaround spot. Now they have to back down a narrow driveway for a half mile to get turned around. So those are great things to think about as well. And then the other thing that I always bring up with people are there other fuel breaks around your property? And if not, can you create other fuel breaks? So this could be driveways, it could be other roads, it could be walking paths, it could be trails, it could be natural things such as creeks or springs or a rock slide. where are those areas where you have some kind of a barrier to stop an advancing fire? I've been on a number of fires over the years where something as simple as a deer trail stopped the advance flame front there of a fire. So there's a lot of things there that, little, mitigation work, cutting some brush back around those trails or pathways or whatever else can go a long way in stopping a oncoming flame front, even sometimes before it gets to your home ignition zone. That was a lot of information in a really short amount of time. Hopefully, you guys had some questions you put in the chat. Hopefully some of those were answered as we were going, and we'll try to get to some of those here in a minute. If you don't feel comfortable, putting your questions in the chat, or if you have other questions that you come up with later on down the road, please write down this email address, and that will come directly to our office, and we can make sure to get that information out to the appropriate people to contact you to answer your questions. So I'll leave this slide up for just a few more minutes before I get to my last slide and move to questions here. All right, so the last slide I have with you guys is just a preview of next month's webinar. So in April, we'll be having a presentation from Jenna Trinidad, who's with the Oregon Department of Forestry. Jenna is the National Fire Plan Coordinator for ODF and is also the Firewise USA Liaison for the state of Oregon. So Jenna will be here talking to us about the Firewise USA program, which is a recognition program for communities to encourage them to look at a lot of the things we just talked about today on a larger scale, rather than individual home site, but really on a community-wide basis, and looking at things that we can do as communities, neighbors, to mitigate fire risk in those areas. So Jenna will be joining us Thursday, April 21st at noon for that presentation.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Kyle. I really appreciate it, and thank you all for spending your evening with us. It's really, really fabulous to see this many folks online. We did have a few questions in the chat, Kyle, so I'll read them to you, especially for our folks on the phone. And we will, if we don't get to all the questions in the chat box too, we also have all of your contact info, attendees, that then we should be able to follow up with you via email if we're not quite sure or not quite able to get through all of your questions. So the first question was from Angelina Dixon. She asked if there are any programs or services that ODF local agencies are able to do the tree cutting around folks' home. I will note that we have a partner from ODF that noted that there are some fuels crews that ODF offers, but maybe Kyle, if you can talk a little bit about OSFM's programs and some opportunities that are available through the fire service.
Yeah, so there's a number of opportunities. Really, it depends on where you are throughout the state, what some of those opportunities are. But some of the opportunities that we're going to have through our office coming up is some grant funding to help local fire jurisdictions with some of these issues, with hiring crews and contractors to come in and help homeowners and communities mitigate some of these risks. So we're still in the early stages of that. We're still trying to figure out what that looks like. But again, there's other options out there. Some fire districts go after grants and allow the community members to use those funds to create defensible space around their home and in their communities. ODF is another resource out there. Sometimes, depending on the project, the size and scope, NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, is another avenue where you may be able to find some funding. So sometimes you got to get a little creative, but there's a lot of funding out there if you start looking in different parts of the state.
Perfect. Thank you. The other question we had was Mitch asked, he said he's been told we never want to remove more than 1/3 of the canopy or crown, especially on younger trees. He asked what your thoughts were on this. In one of the photos, he noticed that it looked like more than 50% was removed. So maybe talk about some best limbing practices to make sure that our trees stay healthy and fire resistive.
So first of all, I am not an arborist. I will throw that out there right off the bat. So if you have specific questions or concerns, reach out to an arborist and talk to them. Again, yeah, you want to make sure that you're not taking too much of that canopy out there, especially on those younger trees. So what I would recommend as that tree grows, maybe take that up 1/3 to begin with. And as that tree continues to grow over the years, take another round off of that. And, once you get your 6 or 10 foot up, as that tree continues to grow, you're good to go there.
Perfect. Thanks, Kyle. And then Chelsea asked, we talked about other flammables right around the house that folks need to be thinking about. She asked what the safest place or way to store flammables, such as gas grills, etc.
So, something like a gas grill isn't a huge hazard per se. Again, we don't want to have everything else stored around it to have a lot of intense heat there to make a problem. But, a gas grill on the back porch isn't my biggest worry. In the event of a fire taking place, if we're starting to, get those evacuation notices and you have enough time and you're doing your walk around, definitely at that point, take that propane tank off, move it a safe distance away or store it properly. But, overall, something like that on a day-to-day basis isn't my biggest concern.
Perfect. And then we had a question from Beth. She asked, if you live next to a city-owned property, is the city required to do fire mitigation on their property? She noted that she lives next to a nature park in Gresham, and there's a lot of downed trees, blackberries, etc., adjacent to her property.
Yeah, so that's a question that we get a lot is, I've done a lot of stuff on my side of the line, but the neighbor may not have. So again, what I recommend is focusing on what you have control over first, and really, working to make sure your side of the fence looks good and is ready to go. And then we can go and we can talk to that neighboring homeowner or land manager or city or whoever it may be and see what we can do together as a team. Maybe we can look for some grant opportunities if they don't have funding for that, or make a plan. It may not be something that gets done right now, but we can start making a plan to chip away with that over time. So, we can't, in situations like this, we can't do anything by ourselves. But if we form those, teamworks and networks and partnerships, we can get a lot done. Unfortunately, it may not happen overnight. It may be something we have to work towards, but I've seen it happen numerous times before.
Okay, perfect. And then we had Jack McCowan put a note in here, talking about in the event of a wildfire, and say folks do receive a warning that they need to evacuate. Is there anything that they need to do while they're evacuating, such as removing cushions, wood chairs, etc., from kind of that home ignition zone? And is there a place they should place them when they're doing that?
Great question. So it's going to depend on, what kind of evacuation notice you get. So there's 3 levels of evacuation notices here in Oregon. There's a level 1, be ready, a level 2, be set, and the level 3, go. And we're going to hopefully have a webinar here in a couple months that goes through all that right before fire season hits. But to answer your question, again, if you get that level 3 evacuation, you need to get out of there quickly. So you may not have time to do all those things. But if you get that level 1 evacuation or that level 2 evacuation, and you take your time and you get the things that you need to get out of your home, and you're prepared, you're packed up, and you still have time, yeah, definitely do that walk around your home and look at what you can do to move stuff away from your home, or maybe limb up a tree or cut out a bush or whatever it may be to help improve your odds if that fire does advance towards your home or you get hit with that ember storm. Check the gutters, do all those things that we just mentioned. Something like cushions, like I mentioned, when I was down in California, we had no way to store those inside homes. We didn't have access to that because everybody was locked up and gone. We chucked those as far away from the home as we could. So if you're, quickly trying to do that, chuck it as far away as you can. If you've got the time, throw it in the garage or in the home where it's secure and you don't have to worry about it.
Perfect. Thank you. And then we did have a note in here, and I'll kind of ask it for the group just so folks are aware, because I know we're getting short on time. Virginia asked a question that might be on a lot of folks' mind, asking if OSFM, Office of State Fire Marshal, conducts home audits or site visits for property owners. Someone who would come to the property and advise, essentially what I think we would advise, and Kyle might disagree with me, but, we would advise maybe starting with your local fire department, reach out to them, see if they have a program that they have somebody to come out and do that. Otherwise, Virginia, or anybody that's looking for that service, feel free to send us an email. We have regional folks. We have our fire risk reduction specialists in 7 regions throughout the state, and their job is to be there to help make those connection points and education points. So we can kind of help coordinate that offline with you, either with your fire department or, with one of our fire risk reduction specialists. So folks that are interested in that, feel free to reach out to us offline about that. And so we'll probably read through 2 more questions. I know we're not going to get to everybody, and then I will follow up with everybody via email kind of on your questions as well. Lee asked, Kyle, mentioned a couple of websites such as IBHS and NHSA. Any recommendations on additional websites? We'll include kind of a resource list for folks, but any additional resources that we can share with folks, or any recommendations on decking materials?
Yeah, so for that kind of home building material, there is a lot of information on the IBHS website, also on the NFPA, National Fire Protection Association. When you get into their FireWise program portion of the website, there's a lot of information, fact sheets on there that you can either print or just view online, and there's a ton of information there. If it sounds like we have everybody's email information from registration, and we can send those links out to the group after the fact, and any other resources that may be applicable as well.
Great. And then I don't know if we're going to dive into decking materials, but any offhand that we can, talk about, good decking materials that we can recommend for folks?
Yeah. So, like I mentioned before, there's a lot of different options out there. Some of those are going to be very fire resistant. Metal doesn't burn very well. On the other side, you've got, your traditional wood or some of those composition type fiber mixed boards. Again, offhand, I don't have the exact science with me, but there is a lot of information on that on the IBHS website. Again, it'll talk about some of the other things we can look at, whether it's the spacing between the boards itself or spacing out, those joists underneath. A lot of that science has been out there and is documented and is available. So we'll make sure to get that on the information that we send out to everybody here.
Perfect. And I think probably the final question with 2 minutes to spare is, Tracy Olson asked about any financial incentives. So I know we touched on that maybe briefly in the first question, but maybe we can wrap up there and then get everybody on with their evening.
Yeah, so again, there's a lot of opportunities coming down the road. There's going to be some opportunities for OSFM to help some of the local fire departments and communities with some grants. The Department of Forestry typically has different kinds of grants that supports the FireWise program. NRCS is another option out there. And there's going to be the potential for a lot of funding coming down through the infrastructure bill that was passed. So there's going to be opportunities, with a number of different agencies. All of them offhand, I don't have off the top of my head right now. But again, there's going to be opportunities coming. A lot of times, it's being creative as well. I worked with a group here in Douglas County the last couple of years that their focus was on oak restoration. And, that's great. I want to save the oaks as much as anybody else. But a lot of the work that they were doing to do that oak restoration was the same kind of work that we were doing for fuels mitigation around homes and communities. So while those dollars didn't say defensible space on it, we were doing the same thing with oak restoration dollars and really getting two results from one fund. So that was a great partnership that we formed with an agency, NRCS, and some other landowners who, may not have thought about that fuels reduction side of thing right off the bat. But again, there's a lot of opportunities coming. Get creative, and you never know what you're going to find out there.
Well, great. So thank you so much, Kyle, for sharing all your knowledge with us. And thank you all that spent your Thursday evening with us. And we will be in touch soon with the recording and a few resources for you all. And don't hesitate to reach out with any other questions.